This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective. Welcome back, everyone, to the International Socialist Alternative show, World to Win. My name's Toya. I'm here, of course, with my co-host Yara, and we have a great show today talking about, of course, the U.S. elections. I mean, unfortunately, it's all everyone's talking about, and I don't know if there's going to be an end in sight. Are we going to stop talking about it? I mean, it's just day after day, number after number, count after count. But today we're going to hear from Ilan, who is a member of Socialist Alternative in Boston. We're going to hear from Alicia, who's a member of Socialist Alternative in Pittsburgh. And at the end, we have an amazing interview with Kshama Sawant, who is the Socialist City Council member in Seattle, who's also a member of the International Socialist Alternative. And of course, make sure you stay tuned for our shout out of the week, which will be very exciting, and special announcements. So let's just get started. Yara, good to see you. How's it going?
Hi, it's been going weirdly. I think like everyone else in the world right now. I think this election has really thrown everyone off and, thrown our sleeping patterns off, definitely, after staying up all night to see the results that haven't been coming in for days. So if we're going to speak about the results for a bit, I want to know one thing. I thought Biden had it in the bag. That's what the polls were saying. They're saying that it looked like a landslide when we looked at the polls. And then it really wasn't. It really wasn't a landslide. So Alicia was wondering, why? Why do you think the polls were so wrong? Why were the analysts so wrong?
So I think like one thing we can consider is how wrong they were also in 2016 when the polls projected that Hillary Clinton would win. And yet again, we see the media predicted this shutout for Biden, right? And a lot of that was predicated on the fact that Trump's approval rating is so low. His handling of the COVID-19 crisis has been an absolute disaster. That alone should have been the basis of a Biden victory, right? Or so you would think. As far as why the polls are off, I mean, I am not an expert, but one thing I've been like really surprised by, and this happened in 2016 as well, and this certainly happened in my home state of Pennsylvania, the Republican Party actually registered a lot of new Republican voters, especially in rural areas. So these might be people who aren't ordinarily engaged by the polls. I myself, as someone who's been able to vote for 12 years now, have only been polled exactly once, right? So they're not reaching everybody, and they're relying on this idea that, Biden had it in the bag because he's not Trump. But that's the problem, right? He's not Trump. He's not running for something. He's just running as not the other guy.
The polls showed it's not going to be even close. And I think so many people thought that was going to be the case. But then we had the situation of waiting days and nights for actual results. And I think that's a really good point, that they haven't been doing well, not in the last 4 years, but also in other countries as well. And maybe it's because the kind of like the way the politics works, the spectrum of politics and why people are going out to vote has changed massively, because I think people are really, exasperated with the situation. People aren't going to go to vote for someone who they don't believe in. And even though, the situation was still a win, it wasn't even close to what the polls predicted. So I think, it is still with all of that, it's still a historic mobilization to defeat Trump. So what do you think? What do you think about that? Do you think that, like you said a little bit about how, people weren't going to vote for Biden because Biden had this amazing agenda that everyone wanted to vote for. So how do you think the Democrats did it? And do you think they could have done it better?
So I think the Democrats really blew it. They really could have had this in the bag and could have won by those larger margins, right? They also could have put a lot more time, not just over the past few months during this general election, but over the past 2 years, 4 years actually engaging working class people, especially in these more rural counties. Often a lot of these cities will naturally vote Democrat because of the more like socially liberal policies that the party pays lip service to at the very least, right? But they haven't actually been engaging those people or like acknowledging the hardships that a lot of those people are going through. So they could have engaged those voters, but they really didn't. They certainly didn't in Pennsylvania. One thing I did note, though, is that Pennsylvania, to your earlier point, the turnout in Pennsylvania was actually much higher this time around. And actually, I think that has to do with the mail-in ballots. So we've seen a lot of attempts by Trump to really suppress the vote, whether that's by cutting the US Postal Service to slow down the mail, which did absolutely have an impact. In fact, I have a friend who did not receive his ballot until the day after the election. So he didn't get to cast his vote. And that was not going to be a vote for Trump. But despite that, and despite the attempts that we see now by Trump to suppress the vote, with all of these lawsuits, the GOP has several lawsuits in my state. There's a lawsuit locally in my city, in Pittsburgh, and it's not just in Pennsylvania, it's in all of these other states where suddenly Trump finds himself trailing because all of these mail-in votes are being counted. We see a larger turnout. And I think that's because, in part, we can only vote on one day out of the month, out of the year, and it's during the window in which most people are working. And that's like if you work a 9-to-5 job and not multiple jobs, right? And one thing that the Bernie Sanders campaign did back in the primaries that always really impressed me is that they had volunteers reaching out to working class people on the midnight shift to engage them in what was going on and what Bernie Sanders was doing and to get them to caucus and things like that. That's something that the Biden campaign could have tried to do, right? But they ultimately don't care about the working class voter. They care about the vote, but not the person, right? Not what all of us are going through. And I think that's reflected also in their lack of a program.
Yeah, I think the voter suppression stuff that Alicia was just talking about is really crazy and really important. There was a county in Texas where Houston is, which is a big city in Texas, that literally had one ballot drop box for 5 million people. I mean, this is insane. This isn't democracy, you know? But we should also be clear that despite this, and despite how close it was, actually, if you look at the number of people that voted for Biden versus voted for Trump, it really wasn't that close. Joe Biden beat Donald Trump by 4 million votes. That's a huge amount. But because we have the Electoral College, which, let's be honest, is one of the most undemocratic institutions in the US and probably one of the more undemocratic institutions in terms of world voting systems, it ended up being, this close. And of course, the Democrats didn't help themselves with this at all. But it really was a historic. I think the fact that 4 million vote gap exists shows how historic of mobilization this was against Trump, how much people hate Trump. It's not, I don't think, this crazy enthusiastic endorsement of corporate Joe Biden, but just how much people really hated him.
So yeah, talking about those, the amount of people that actually voted for Biden versus voted for Trump, 4 million is a huge number. But that means there were still millions and millions of people that did vote for Trump. I know I live in a blue state. In my town, you could see like the breakdown, and only about 1,000 more people voted for Biden as opposed to voted for Trump. And we're seeing these numbers come out where, more Black men are voting for Trump. But specifically talking about the white working class before we talk about other, sectors of the working class that did vote for Trump. Alon, what does this say about white America or the white working class? Is the white working class just innately racist?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think we need to talk about it in society over the coming weeks and months. Like, how is it so close? Why did so many people vote for Trump? Et cetera, et cetera. And as a white working class person myself, I can say that there definitely are white working class people who are racist. And U.S. society is one hell of a racist place. There's no doubt about it. We live in a deeply racist system. But I also don't think that it's accurate to just write off the white working class as racist. And, a few statistics, I think, can show that, first of all, as you said, 20% of Black men voted for Trump, right? More Latinos voted for Trump in 2016 than in either of the three previous Republican candidates. And that was even smashed this year. In fact, in Florida, you could actually make the argument that it was Latinos that gave the election to Trump. And this is, of course, after, Trump was horrendously xenophobic, horrendously racist towards Latinos throughout his throughout his presidency, the crisis of, the detention of child immigrants, the separation of families, all of this stuff was awful. But the thing is that in Florida, which went to Trump, 61% of people voted to raise the minimum wage to $15. You have in Mississippi, which is, dismissed by, corporate Democrats like Hillary Clinton as, oh, it's just a basket of deplorables. Well, Mississippi actually voted in a referendum to change the design of their flag away from a Confederate flag-based design and towards something else. So I don't think that it's fair to just say that, but also Mississippi went for Trump. So the point is that it's not just fair to say that all Trump voters are racist or that it's that simple. And I think the reality is that we had a candidate actually that put forward a working class message of things like a $15 an hour minimum wage, of things like Medicare for all, which Fox News, that right-wing bastion, Fox News, said that in their exit poll, 72% of people indicated support for Medicare for all. We had a candidate that was against Trump, that advocated for these things, that helped working class people. And what did the Democratic Party do? They sabotaged him in the primaries, and they put up the most risky, horrendous, uninspiring corporate candidate imaginable, really, the likes of Joe Biden. And I think ultimately, that combined with the voter suppression and all of this stuff is why, it was as close as it was.
Yeah, and I think it's always easy to kind of try to divide the country up based on different groups, but the truth is that most working class people, no matter what group they're in, are in a terrible place right now, especially with COVID, but even before then. So like looking for alternatives is something that everyone's been looking for, and a lot of people have been looking for. The thing is, Trump has been in office for 4 years now, and the alternative hasn't shown up.
Yeah, so I think those are really, really great points. And I think that when we're considering kind of where we go from here, because it does look like a lot of these states are now going to be won by Joe Biden, right? I think what we have to ask ourselves as we look at a Biden administration is, where did Trumpism come from in the first place, right? Because we had an Obama-Biden administration that flipped over to the administration that we had now. And we saw Trump able to mobilize a lot of disenfranchised working class, and yes, a lot of white disenfranchised working class people. And rather than aim all of that at and actually follow through with policies that aimed that took on big business interests, he instead pivoted to these more right-wing nationalist fears, right? And we've seen this historically. But I think that we have to realize that a lot of people following the 2008 recession, seeing wages stagnate, hourly wages are $7.25 in Pennsylvania. And if you look at Florida, which just voted in favor of the $15 an hour minimum wage, but went to Trump, I think we see very clearly that, a vote for Trump is actually, a frustration with the corporate Democrats who, again, don't offer a way forward for working class people. So we have to ask ourselves, where does Trumpism come from? And it is that desperation. And we're going to see that desperation. We're seeing that desperation multiply now with the COVID pandemic crisis, with mass unemployment, with healthcare costs rising. And we have this potential next president saying that he would veto Medicare for all when we can't afford the costs of healthcare, that he wouldn't pass a Green New Deal while half of our country is on fire and the other half is sinking, right? And so these are things that the Biden administration are going there, that it's going to oversee and will have to address. And if it doesn't, we have a potential, like the potential to see this country polarize even further, right? The far right won't necessarily go away. And what we need to do to ensure that we don't see another Trump is to continue to organize. We rightfully deserve that sigh of relief, but we can't sit back, right? We need to continue to organize in our workplaces, on our campuses, and understand that like this fight against Trumpism is not over once Trump is out of office.
So speaking of Trump being out of office, he's laid the groundwork for that not to be a thing. He's been saying from the beginning and putting forward these ideas of fraudulent ballots, laying the groundwork to really not leave the White House. Ilan, what do you think about this as a possibility? I know Socialist Alternative, we've been talking about this for a while. Last Wednesday we were, protesting across the country, talking about don't let Trump steal the election. But the problem was working class people just wanted to count the votes first before they had this discussion, really. They wanted to know who won by counting. We're not going to talk about Trump stealing the election, but he has not let this go. Is there a possibility in your mind, Alon, that Trump could still try to not leave the White House in January?
Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest, it was pretty surreal on Tuesday night at 2:30 a.m. my time to watch, the president of the United States get up there and basically, before there was, 10, 20 plus million votes still yet to be counted. And he says, oh, I've won the election, it's over, all the votes have been counted, all these other votes are illegal and stuff like that. I mean, it's crazy. It's honestly crazy to see. And in Socialist Alternative, yeah, we have been preparing for it for a while. And there was actually this thing on Twitter where like we had a banner that said, along the lines of like count every vote, don't let Trump steal the election. It was printed beforehand so it could be used on the demonstrations the day after the election. And people were like, oh my God, how did they know that this was going to happen? Like, how did you anticipate this or whatever? But in Socialist Alternative, we'd been preparing for this because we knew that it could be close because the Democrats were super weak. And that if Trump was ahead, he's been saying he was going to try and steal the election. But the Democrats were doing nothing to prepare for this. And in Socialist Alternative, our view was that we had to learn the lessons of the last 4 years of Trump's presidency, that the Democrats have not once been effective in stopping Trump's agenda and fighting his right wing and crazy attacks. In the first days of his administration with the Muslim ban, right? Trump was forced to back down by mass action and protests at the airports, not the Democratic Party. The government shutdown was forced to end by TSA agents and by the heroic threat of strike action by air traffic controllers, by flight attendants and air traffic controllers, not, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and the corporate Democrats. And then what did we see just in the last few weeks? Amy Coney Barrett, this like crazy right-wing Christian cult member appointed to the Supreme Court, and the Democrats sit back and let it happen. So in Socialist Alternative, we had been talking, for weeks really, that if Trump tries to steal the election before every vote is counted, we have to be ready for mass protests, even strike action, student walkouts, and stuff like this, because we cannot just sit back and wait for the Democrats. And so, we were going out, passing out flyers, hanging up posters, etc. We helped to organize demonstrations across the country. And thousands of people came out across the country to do this. And I think the question now, can Trump, still try to steal the election? He has these, lawsuits up there, but legal experts pretty much across the board say that, there's nothing really to it. Can he mobilize his base? Yes, he can for protests, and we would need to counter that with even bigger mobilizations on our side. So I think if the Supreme Court,
I got to interrupt you. I got to interrupt you real quick, because talking about mobilizing his base, I mean, before the election, Trump had mobilized some groups of people, and it was kind of scary. These groups like the Proud Boys that have come out of this, that have come out of Trump's presidency. And it seems like he's starting to do that. We saw in Pennsylvania him mobilizing people to try to stop them from counting the vote. So can you talk a little bit more about like what that would mean if Trump were to mobilize a base? Like, do we see this, as a threat going forward, basically?
Sure. So yeah, it certainly is a threat. And again, like if he does that, we need to not waste a single second in having mobilizations that are 20 times as big as Trump's mobilizations. And we've seen this before, like in 2017 in Charlottesville, when there was those big far right rally, that left-wing protester Heather Heyer was killed, unfortunately, by a neo-Nazi. And then after that, over 60 far-right demonstrations were called across the city. And what happened in Toy and my home city of Boston? 40,000 people marched, which Socialist Alternative was, of course, a part of. And after that, all of these far-right demonstrations across the country were canceled. And so I think we need to be clear that our power is far bigger, far stronger. We have more people than they do, and we would need to mobilize in opposition and not let Trump run the show. And I also think, just as a last point, that if the Supreme Court, if the new conservative majority Supreme Court tries to, intervene in this situation and tip the scales in favor of Trump, I think, from their point of view, even that would be extremely dangerous. I think so we would see protests on the scale of Black Lives Matter this summer. We would see millions of people out in the streets to fight against these undemocratic attacks.
Yeah, and I think we also see kind of like Trump throwing this tantrum, and we've seen like looking at it, it sounds like, this weird story that you would tell about like dark times, about like how president just isn't going to leave. But it's happening, and he is doing it, and he is acting like an actual child, just trying to hold on to the last bits of power that he's got. But at the same time, I think what was really interesting was to see that not only did he did manage to mobilize some of his base, but not only did he not manage to do it on the scale that maybe a lot of us feared that he would, but also the Republican establishment kind of threw him out out in the cold and basically ignored his tantrum, which I think is really interesting to see in terms of what kind of like how the ruling class is treating him, and how the ruling class is kind of treating him differently maybe to the way that they did before, and how they're kind of rejecting him now. And I was wondering, because if would that actually mean that Trump is now going to become the sort of martyr? Do we think that if Trump loses and can't manage to mobilize on a scale that would allow him to seal the election, do we think that Trumpism is dead, or do we think they might get stronger?
Well, first of all, Trumpism is far from dead, and I'll get back to that in a second. But to think that Trumpism could be dead would be a really dangerous idea for the left. But on first, what you're talking about the Republican establishment, yeah, it's actually really crazy to see. I mean, we always said that the ruling class didn't like Trump. They preferred the kind of pre-Trump, quote unquote, stability, which of course for working class people like ourselves is not stability. It's still crisis, that we always face. But from the ruling class's point of view, that's how they see it. But now you have, Chris Christie coming out and saying, Don, just count the votes, guy. Like you have, Donald Trump calling up Rupert Murdoch, the CEO of Fox News, saying, hey, why'd you call Arizona for Biden? What the hell, man? And Rupert Murdoch is being like, dude, just count the votes, calm down. You have Mitch McConnell saying, hey, we're going to count the votes, like calm down. And you have Twitter, banning Trump's tweets, making people not being able to, to be able to retweet his tweets. And so I think you do see that the Republican establishment and the big section of the ruling class is moving against Trump. But again, we cannot. It would be a huge mistake to sit back and think that the ruling class, that the ruling elite in our country, and the Republican establishment can be trusted in any way to stave off right-wing attacks or anything like that. And I just want to read, there was a New York Post, which is a right-wing publication in New York City, came out with an article that was talking about how Trump won the biggest share of non-white voters out of any Republican presidential candidate in the last 60 years. And this is a quote from that article. They say, it's yet unclear whether Team Trump will get a second term, but the path forward for the Republican Party is clear regardless. The GOP, which already has its strong base of support among non-college educated white voters, must learn to govern like a working class, multi-ethnic, multiracial party. And this is exactly the danger, that if the left doesn't offer an alternative to the corporate Democratic Party, that people of color And working class people will continue to move to the right, continue to move to Trumpism, whether, whoever is in office. And so it frankly, it doesn't matter that Trump is out of office. The threat of the growth of the right is still a problem because we still have all the crises presented by the capitalist system. And so the question on the agenda for us under a Biden presidency is not to let our foot off the gas, but continue full throttle ahead on the offensive for things like Medicare for all, a Green New Deal, defunding the police, canceling student debt, all of this stuff. And what does this require? This requires building a new party to the left of the Democrats, a working class party, and of course, building the socialist movement too.
Yeah, I think this is really, really important, like the way that this kind of fight back on the ground is the only way to stave it off, and also organizing and building a movement against. I think, again, this is something that we can relate to internationally. I think the whole point that you just made about how there's a situation, there's a crisis that's not just a crisis of coronavirus, it's a crisis of the capitalist system as a whole. And people are seeing it, people are trying to find an alternative to it. And right now, there isn't a left alternative. So they are moving to the right. And that is why it's so important for us to organize. And this is also why these protests on the street are so important right now as a kind of like a starting point for these organizations. And I was wondering, I don't often have so many people who are actually on the ground in these protests around. So I want to ask, Toya, can you tell us a little bit about what's happening in your city?
Yeah, I mean, the protest that happened, on Wednesday, which is the day after people could go to the ballots and vote, we saw these happen across the country, and they were called by many different organizations, and many different organizations on a political spectrum, right? But the main theme that we saw in Boston was, first and foremost, we cannot let Trump steal this election, as we talked about previously, but also no matter who's in office, we have to continue to fight. And what we saw in Boston, was the people that came out to the streets, it wasn't nearly as big as we saw after George Floyd was murdered or, during the height of the Breonna Taylor investigation. But what we saw was mainly young people who have been involved in the Bernie Sanders movement, who have been involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. These are new activists, we should call them, right? They aren't necessarily a part of any sort of organization, but these are new activists that are wanting to continue the fight against climate change, for Medicare for all, rent control, and some of the better elements of the protests were talking about things like, we don't want to see just Black faces in high places like Kamala Harris. The Democratic Party is really relying on her to bring along Black youth. You know what I mean? And there was this mood that that's not what we want. We want to fight against the system, a very strong anti-capitalist mood. And what Socialist Alternative was able to do was really put forward the ideas of, yes, we are against the system, we need a new system, but what is that system, right? What are we fighting for? We're fighting for socialism. And in the more short term, we're fighting for a workers' party, right? I had the privilege of speaking in front of the Boston Public Library and Copley Plaza. And I think I got the biggest cheers, Yara, when I said the Democrats suck. Everyone was going crazy. And I said, what we need. Yeah, exactly. What we need is a workers' party. And so I think this is a really good opportunity for especially socialists to really have these types of conversations with people. We had another speaker who, was a union member getting up and talking about the fact that, during this COVID pandemic, all the austerity that was put forward, all the cuts, and there wasn't any sort of stimulus, and calling out both parties. And that really is what got the biggest echo, And so although the protests weren't the biggest we've seen, it was definitely a more anti-establishment, anti-capitalist, I think we can say, type of mood. But I know that wasn't necessarily the case across the country. And I mean, even in Boston, we had some protests that were just basically like count the vote, which of course is important, but we want to take it a little further. Alicia, what was it like in Pittsburgh?
So actually, Toya, it sounds like it was very similar in Pittsburgh as to what you experienced on the ground in Boston. But I mean, first of all, to some of the points that Alon made earlier, we saw very clearly that we couldn't rely on the Democratic Party to prepare for a potential fight back, right? Where it wasn't necessarily certain that Biden could turn things around. And they were relying on that, right? Rather than, preparing for what we've been preparing for, at least the attempts by Trump to steal the election. So we actually saw forces tied to the Democratic Party call off count every vote protests the same day. And it actually caused some confusion where we had people reaching out to us saying, hey, are we still going to be in the streets today? Because I saw this other protest was canceled, right? And so people got that memo. And I think that kind of mixed with maybe certain fears of the far right coming out to intimidate the vote counting efforts did maybe dampen the turnout for some of the protests that we actually saw in Pittsburgh. But I would say that the mood amongst those who did turn out was so similar. And we saw very much the same thing. We saw Black Lives Matter activists coming out. We saw housing activists coming out who are fighting for things like, they're fighting against gentrification in our city. Our city is rapidly gentrifying. We're in a Rust Belt stretch here where it's more affordable than a city like Boston, but that's changing very, very rapidly. So we had housing activists, we had union members. Our entire rally was led by a member of the United Steelworkers, right? We had, young people, again, same thing, Students for Bernie, different chapters from different schools, both high schools and college campuses alike. And this is the material that we can use to create a new independent political alternative to this rotten two-party system that we have. And that was actually something that various speakers touched on, whether they were members of Socialist Alternative or identified as socialists themselves. They were talking about the same things. They were talking about real working class democracy. One of our speakers, who's a member of the Poor People's Campaign, gave a phenomenal speech where she asked people to think about what working class democracy really is. Yes, we're defending democracy and we're defending the vote, but democracy is so much more than just that, right? Just these two options between two corporate parties who don't care about us. We also want democratic control over our workplaces. We want democratic control over our communities where, we're fighting here in Pittsburgh for community control over the police, control over public safety, right? So these are some of the things that were in the air very much. And people recognize that while Joe Biden, yes, the Democrats suck, Joe Biden sucks, he is a weak centrist, there is also the recognition that here in Pittsburgh, we have a progressive Democrat who is very much on the same side of a lot of these issues with Biden. He wants to increase police funding while we are facing $100 million shortfall here in Pittsburgh, right? And that's the entirety of the police budget, which I understand might be smaller than it is in Boston, but people are recognizing these. They're recognizing the priorities of the Democratic Party, and we're not the priority of the Democratic Party.
I think that's really a really important point that I think also kind of leads me to maybe trying to get us to look at the Marxist crystal ball and kind of make some predictions for the future, which is always fun to see. But I was wondering, Alicia, what do you think is going to happen now with kind of a Biden administration? Do you think, because we've talked a lot about how Biden won and it's an important win against Trump, but it's also at the same time bittersweet because Biden is definitely not the candidate that we would want to see win the election. Obviously, it's not Trump either. But I think the problem that we talked about not having an alternative is really glaring when we talk about Biden. So how do you think this new administration is going to affect the world and affect the US specifically?
Well, I think in a lot of ways we can see a continuation of the same corporate policies that we've seen. I mean, we've got a taste of it during the Obama administration. After the 2008 recession, we saw Obama and Biden bail out Wall Street, right? We saw this again with Trump during the coronavirus crisis. And I think that we can easily see this again, right? There will be, there will certainly be like certain measures to try and provide some relief, but it's not the widespread relief that we're going to need, right? And that can only be won through the very same things that Alon is talking about with like mass mobilizations of people fighting it. And we can't forget, we also have a conservative Supreme Court that is going to chip away at what democratic rights we have under a capitalist society right now. And we should be looking to the examples of like women and queer people in Poland who just yet again reversed an attempt to ban abortion, which is certainly on the menu for this current Supreme Court to talk about, you know, the continuation of far right ideas beyond Trump, right? So we have to be prepared to fight and defend these things, but also to win more. Like we need things like a Medicare for all. We need things like a Green New Deal. We need a massive infrastructure project, green new jobs, green infrastructure, green energy across the board. These are things that Joe Biden has never been interested in actually affecting at all. And in fact, like my Facebook feed was like flooded with all of these ads saying that he will absolutely not ban fracking, right? And I mean, we have to be like also very clear, and this is particularly the case here in Western Pennsylvania. This is essentially coal country, right? And there is a lot, like we're on top of a big slab of shale. There are working people who are afraid of their jobs. And this like threat of taking away fracking is like an existential threat for a lot of these families who are struggling. So we also need a political alternative that is like, and a Green New Deal that is actively engaging working people and making sure that working people have jobs in these sectors and are like brought into these new industries and not just left behind to like starve or struggle with like black lung with no Medicare, right? So we still have to like really like prepare to fight for the things that we need. And we need unions to step up. I mean, like we see like right now, like with different unions, like saying that, okay, if Trump tries to steal an election, we'll go on general strike. But what are we doing to actually like build for that and build for that beyond like the threat of the presidency being stolen, right? We need to be doing that to actually win more things for working class people, including these things like Medicare for all and a Green New Deal. It's going to take that kind of organized, mobilized fight back to place all of the pressure on the capitalist system.
I'm glad you brought up the unions, Alicia, because I mean, this is something that needs to be discussed. What are the unions going to do? Are they, you know, in a Biden presidency, are they just going to sigh relief and say we don't have to worry about right to work, which is such a terrible name for that policy, but we don't have to worry about right to work coming and taking away our union rights? Or are we going to continue this momentum of fighting for things that we actually need? I mean, especially something like a Green New Deal, which Biden by no means has any plans to even give us a crumb in regards to an actual step towards fighting climate change. But Alon, I wanted to, you know, kind of close out here. If the Biden presidency is going to bring some sort of honeymoon, and when I say that, I mean just sort of this period where people are feeling relieved that Trump is gone, grateful that we don't have a racist, sexist, xenophobic, openly, those things, you know, guy in office. What does this mean for the socialist movement and, you know, in the US, but also worldwide? Is it going to be more difficult? What are your thoughts on that?
So, yeah, I totally think that, people are going to breathe a sigh of relief and have been breathing a sigh of relief since Trump, for him being out of office. And it certainly is nice to see that guy be sent packing with his back against the wall, you know, in such a serious way. But the thing is that when the Republicans are in office and they're putting forward all of these attacks, people say, well, oh, you know, that's why we need to elect Democrats to get the Republicans out so things can be better. But in Socialist Alternative, we don't have confidence that under the Democrats, things will get better, because ultimately the decisive factor for whether progressive change happens or whether regressive change doesn't happen is not, never has been, and never will be who's in the White House. The decisive factor is how strong are our movements, the power of the working class, and the capacity and willingness of the working class to take mass action. And so I think when it comes to prospects of the socialist movement and the workers' movement, yes, while in the short term, there could be a downturn in struggle and people could sit back and wait to see what Biden does. But we should be also clear that we are in the deepest economic depression worldwide that we've been in since the 1930s. The capitalist crisis is not wrapping up anytime soon. The environmental crisis is not wrapping up anytime soon. There is systemic racism. There is horrendous, there's an escalation of inter-imperialist tensions and conflict worldwide. And so the reality is that, the socialist movement has, in my view, a bright future, actually. And the sky is the limit, really, for us. And I think just to talk about one concrete issue, for why this is and what our tasks are, is with the Green New Deal, which has come up. We need 100% renewable energy by 2030. First of all, Biden calls for 100% renewable energy by 2050, which does absolutely nothing to stop climate change. We need it by 2030. But are the fossil fuel corporations going to let us just do that? Absolutely not. And so what this poses, the question of a Green New Deal poses, is actually taking the fossil fuel corporations into public ownership and putting them under democratic workers' control. But not just the fossil fuel corporations, also manufacturing industry, the logistics industry, transportation of resources, all of these things. The profit motive needs to be removed, and we need to put first and foremost the needs of working people and the planet. But to do this is not possible on the basis of capitalism, where everything is run for profit. And so that's why we're socialists, that even to win these sorts of reforms, like a Green New Deal to save the planet, we need to build the socialist movement. And that's why, if you're watching from the United States, I urge you really, please join Socialist Alternative. But also, socialism is not something that can be done in one country. Socialism is an international movement. And that's why we're all, the four of us, part of International Socialist Alternative. And no matter where you're watching from, contact us at International Socialist Alternative, and please get active, because we really have no time to lose in building the movement against this crazy system and for socialism.
Thanks, Alon. And quickly, Alicia, what are your thoughts on the socialist movement?
Yeah, I have to really second Alon's fighting optimism. And one thing that I've kept in mind, heading into a Biden administration, or even heading into a Trump administration, if that ended up being the case, is look at what happened after Trump was first elected. That's when I started to realize that I was a socialist, right? That's when I joined Socialist Alternative. And not only that, we saw, as Alon had pointed out, mass mobilizations to defend people against the travel ban, to defend people against ICE raids and things like that. We saw a massive teacher strike wave, again, in red states, like these Trump states, right? We saw the power of the working class mobilize and actually win serious victories. And I remember going down to West Virginia and talking to a lot of people who were upset at this Democratic coal-bearing governor because he had no interests of working people in mind, and there were no illusions in either party, right? So the materials are here. Black Lives Matter is the largest protest movement in history. The Democratic Socialists of America have also grown as Socialist Alternative has grown. So the materials are absolutely here, and we have to keep building from here.
Thanks so much, Alicia. And as Alon said, if you're watching this in the US, please check out our website, our Facebook, our Instagram. And after this broadcast, actually, many cities across the US are going to be having public meetings to talk about what's next in the movement. So be sure to check out our Facebook page to find out if there's one happening near you. So now we have an interview that we did earlier today with Seattle City Council member Kshama Sawant. I'm so excited to be able to talk to Socialist City Council member Kshama Sawant, who's a member of the International Socialist Alternative here in the US. Welcome, Kshama. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you for having me, Toya.
Yeah, so let's just get right into it. There's so much to talk about, and I want to make sure we can get through all the questions that we have for you. So today's show, we're really talking about what's going on with the US elections. Obviously, this is something that everybody around the world, to be honest, is really talking about. But can you comment on the elections themselves, in regards to the Democratic Party establishment and what their role is in this whole situation? Because a lot of this is being pointed at the Republicans and what they're doing, trying to steal the election. But what role has the Democratic Party played?
Yes, the fact that this election was even close at all is an enormous indictment of Biden and the Democratic Party establishment, because Trump has been a historically abysmal, deeply unpopular president who should have been easy to defeat. And Trump's almost certainly would have been handily defeated had the Democrats not gone all out to crush Bernie Sanders and viciously reject the most popular parts of Bernie's platform, like Medicare for all, Green New Deal jobs program, union jobs with clean energy, taxing the rich instead of working people, and calling Trump out for his selling out of working people through the historic corporate tax cuts and numerous other attacks on workers and communities of color. That would have been the platform that could have united tens of millions of working people and young people across race and wiped Trump off the map decisively. But the Democratic Party rejected that offhand in favor of defending the status quo, which, no surprise, utterly failed to inspire young voters, working class voters, and voters of color. I mean, just note the statistics. 75% of voters who voted for Biden report that their vote was primarily a vote against Trump, not for Biden. And Trump rose to power in the first place because millions of people were furious at both parties of Wall Street. By the summer of last year, Joe Biden had already promised wealthy donors that, quote, nothing would fundamentally change, end quote, if he is elected, that his plan would not involve any new taxes on the rich. And if he's elected, he won't let them down. And fundamentally, we have to note a party rooted in capitalism is simply incapable of dealing with the crises that working people face. And the long-term burden, unless we fight back, will fall on the tens of millions of Americans in the form of wage stagnation, permanent job losses, ravaged economies in many areas, and eviction epidemics. And we've already seen the global billionaire class increase their wealth to over $1 trillion during the pandemic. In Seattle, where I am based, for example, Amazon and Starbucks are pandemic profiteers, reporting record third quarter profits at the same time that tens of thousands in our city are reeling from job losses, barely able to pay for rent and food. And last but not least, Joe Biden has flatly refused to call for even minimal reforms to address police accountability and the larger problem of systemic racism in capitalist America. Joe shoot them in the leg. Biden had nothing whatsoever to say in condemnation of the recent brutal killing of our Black brother, Walter Wallace Jr., at the hands of Philadelphia police, but instead, he talked about the violence that resulted because ordinary people are correctly angry at yet another killing at the hands of the police. And he said, there's no excuse whatsoever for the looting and the violence, none whatsoever. All of this shows that the Democratic Party fundamentally is not on the side of ordinary working people. And that's the underlying problem that's being unfolded with this such a close election against Donald Trump.
Thanks so much. And I mean, the number that you gave, 75% of people just voting, against Trump, not necessarily excited about Biden. I know I've seen this at work talking to people. When they talk about these establishment politicians, calling them things like crooks, and all of these bailouts that the ruling class and the capitalists and the bosses are receiving. So with this huge number of people, just wanting to get rid of Trump, but not necessarily excited about the Democrats, do you think that now, a Biden presidency would lay the groundwork for a new party, something that could actually excite the working class to vote for?
I think you're absolutely right, Toya. I mean, the statistics are such an overwhelming evidence that ordinary people in America are ready for something totally different. But what we have on offer right now is Biden and the Democrats making it perfectly clear that they would have risked a second term of Trump rather than having the candidate who could have handily defeated Trump, which is Bernie Sanders, with his campaign for a political revolution against the billionaire class. And this is an absolute tragedy. It's a repeat of the failed strategy from 2016, when the Democratic Party single-mindedly followed their agenda of defeating Bernie Sanders in the primary by running Hillary Clinton, who epitomized corporate and wealthy people and was deeply unpopular with the working class. That is why Socialist Alternative, which is the US organization of the International Socialist Alternative, did not support our campaign for Biden, because we think the only way to actually defeat the continued growth of Trumpism is to build a new party, a new mass party for working people, a party that takes no corporate money and that will fight unambiguously for working people and oppressed communities. And I think we've seen again and again that there is a huge opening for making this happen. And it has to concretely be worked on, not just abstractly be brought up by socialist organizations. And so Socialist Alternative disagree with Bernie Sanders' complete capitulation to the Democratic establishment. And unfortunately, even organizations on the left, including sections of the Democratic Socialists of America, while correctly criticizing Biden and the Democrats, ended up offering the message that stopping the right-wing nightmare means supporting Joe Biden. Well, we've now seen from the knife's edge that the election results have hung on, a lot of working people simply don't agree with supporting a corporate Democrat who promises that nothing will change, and these people are currently looking for an alternative. Most crucially, if defeating the rise of the right wing and of reactionary ideas is an urgent goal, which of course I completely agree with as a socialist, we have to understand that channeling working people year after year into the Democratic Party is going to do the exact opposite of that. The Democrats controlled the White House and both branches of Congress during the 2008 Great Recession, which was then at that time the worst financial crisis in the US since the Great Depression until now, which is now the worst crisis since the Great Depression. But what did the Democrats do with their stronghold in Washington, D.C. at that time? Barack Obama gave trillions of dollars to bail out the big banks who caused the crisis, rather than the working people who faced at least 9 million jobs lost and 4 million homes foreclosed on. The Democrats' predictable abandonment of working people during the Obama-Biden administration, which itself followed the reckless deregulation and financialization and attacks on working people in the Clinton and Bush presidencies before that, all of that laid the basis for Trump's surprise victory in 2016, because Democrats were simply not able to motivate working class people to get out and cast a vote for Hillary Clinton, whose presidency promised to give them more of the same, which is more of the crushing of their living standards. I mean, note that more than 200 counties that supported Obama in 2012 flipped for Trump just 4 years later. So not only did the Democrats lay out a red carpet from Trump's Manhattan penthouse directly to the steps of the White House, they've done a grand total of nothing to fight him during the 4 years he's been there. I mean, I want to ask, who will represent the over 20 million young people who made history on the streets of America just months ago in the multiracial working class movement against racism and police violence? And it's not just that. The George Floyd protests captured a deeper anger that entire generations of America are feeling at the entire system. The left, especially the socialist movement, has to take its responsibilities seriously in the face of the miseries tens of millions of Americans are facing, in addition to the ravages from the pandemic and the dangers of climate catastrophe. And if we don't, it will be a historic abdication of responsibility. We have to be clear, Trumpism will not end with Trump unless working people build independent fighting mass movements and begin to build our own party for the working class. And right-wing populism and far-right forces, if we don't do that, are likely to grow even further under Joe Biden's administration, because that administration is going to be a thoroughly corporate administration, which will force the working class to pay for the crisis of capitalism, which will only then further feed working class people as fodder to right-wing ideas. So if we want to defeat Trumpism now, if we want to avoid future and more dangerous emergence of the kind of what we have seen with Donald Trump, then we have to build a new party.
I want to stop you right there, Kshama, because, this idea of, a new party and fighting against Trumpism is something really that, here in the US, Socialist Alternative has been trying to talk about. This idea that we can't let Trump steal the election, but also if Biden wins, we have to continue the fight onto, independent politics, a new party. And you in Seattle have really demonstrated that that is possible. I love talking to people about the work that we've done and that you've done in Seattle to show that we can work outside of the Democratic Party. So for those that are watching that aren't familiar with the work of your council office in Seattle, and just a reminder for the rest of us, can you talk a little bit about some of the work that you've been able to put forward because you organize outside of the Democratic Party?
I think the example we've shown in Seattle is tremendously important, even though it's a small example, because it shows how socialists and social movements, workers, union members can dramatically alter the course of politics, which is exactly what we have done since our first election in 2013, running as an independent socialist in a city dominated by the Democratic Party establishment. And we've repeatedly set powerful examples that have spread nationally. In 2014, less than 6 months after we took office, Seattle became the first major city to pass the $15 minimum wage, which I'm sure many of you have heard. Now Florida, the state that voted for Trump in this election, actually approved by a huge majority a $15 minimum wage for that state. So, remember, all of that movement for $15 an hour started right here in Seattle with socialists and workers and young people. We've also won landmark renters victories. One of the big ones we won is a ban on landlords evicting renters in the winter months. But recently, we won another historic victory, which is the Amazon tax to fund affordable housing and a Green New Deal, which is a $2 billion transfer of wealth from wealthy corporations to ordinary people over the next decade. The main thing is we've consistently used our elected office as a platform for building movements of workers, union members, socialists, marginalized communities, youth, and also rank and file Democratic Party supporters. Just for context, our office is the lone socialist in Seattle. The rest of the 8 members of the city council are all Democrats. And we, in our 7 years in office, we've demonstrated a fundamentally different approach than the Democratic politicians who say that they support working people, but then their actions show something very different, which is that at the end of the day, they are representing the interests of corporations and the wealthy, or at best, limiting themselves to what's acceptable to big business. Instead of that, we have used our office to unambiguously fight for working people and against the status quo by using our office to build movements and not relying on some sort of insider strategy, which we know it doesn't work. And as a workers representative, I take home the average worker's wage, donating the rest of my 6-figure salary after taxes to social movements. And last year, we won our second re-election, or in other words, third election, despite historic opposition from Amazon and the other corporations, and also the entire Democratic establishment being against us. We used our campaign as a platform to build the support for Amazon tax, which we then won this summer. And during the campaign, we asked the question, who gets to run Seattle? Big business and the wealthy, or working people? And I think that is the message that really galvanized working people, the message of class struggle, the understanding that we cannot artificially build common cause with the wealthy and with big business, because the system simply doesn't work that way. Their interests are completely opposed to our interests, and we should unabashedly and unapologetically fight for the interests of working class people, young people, marginalized communities, all of those who are left out of the prosperity of this system. And I think this connects to the question of the new party as well, because there's a lot of people in America who say, well, political pundits often who say that we can have independent left candidates in local races, but not federally, because that's too much. I'm sorry, they're living in dreamland. Our experience in Seattle has shown that even one example is intolerable to them, even at a city level. And that's why we're seeing now a new attack on us, and maybe we will have time to talk about that as well.
Yeah, actually, that was going to be my next question. It's just insane that, after all of these years of all the work that we've been doing, to get these attacks and basically a recall campaign against you. Can you speak a little bit to that and what's going on in Seattle with this recall effort?
Yeah, as I was saying, last year, big business and the billionaire class went all out to buy the election in their attempt to get socialists out of City Hall. And they knew that concretely, if we were going to win, then we were going to fight for the Amazon tax and the Green New Deal. And we just won the Amazon tax partially to fund the Green New Deal. So last year, corporations broke all records of the money they spent on any Seattle election in Seattle's history, but still they were not able to beat our grassroots organized movement. And it really was a movement which brought together baristas, tech workers, teachers, iron workers, electricians, and forged a fighting campaign that many were involved in. And I'm sure many who are watching this were involved in the campaign. So this recall attack is an attempt by the billionaires to try and use their wealth and influence to have a do-over of the election because they didn't like the results. I mean, look at Trump. He's refusing to accept that he is losing the election. You know, right now we're speaking on Friday afternoon on November 6th, and he's threatening to file lawsuits. Some of the lawsuits have already been filed. In the same way, the right wing and big business in Seattle, they're refusing to accept the election results from last year and want a do-over. And so what they've done is turn to the courts, and now the recall attempt is likely going to be on the ballot, and voters will be voting on it. And who's behind this? It's people like Martin Seelig, who is a billionaire and a major Trump donor. In 2018, he spent $25,000 trying to overturn the first effort for the Amazon tax. So we have to take this attack seriously. And also we have to remember this attack is not just on me. It is on the socialist movement, but it is on working people and the Black Lives Matter movement as well. And it's no accident that 2 of the 4 recall charges against my office are directly related to my loyal support for the Justice for George Floyd protest. And that, and basically the recall effort is an attack against the courage of young people of multiple races who walked out on the streets for the Black Lives Matter movement, demanding community control over the police and demanding that the police be defunded. So it is in our collective interest to fight back and understand that we all, those of us who are fighting for a different kind of society, who are fed up with the domination of big business, who are done with a society that foments racism, sexism, and bigotry, we all have a stake in defending against the recall campaign.
It's really inspirational, all the work that you're doing to fight these right-wing attacks. But for everyone who's watching, socialists and non-socialists alike, what can people around the world do to support this effort to defend this important seat that we have in Seattle?
Well, if you're watching this and if you're in the United States, we really need your support in different ways. First of all, I would really urge everybody to go to kshamasolidarity.org, which is our solidarity campaign to defeat the recall effort by big business. We need financial contributions from ordinary people because our campaign, as always, will be fueled by the self-sacrifice and the determination of working people and young people, union members, workers who want to fight against the big business and the billionaire class. And if you're watching this, but you're not in the United States, I really urge you to both go to kshamasolidarity.org and socialistalternative.org and our international website, which is internationalsocialist.org, to get more information about what we stand for and why you should get involved if you are fighting against climate change, if you want a society free of sexual violence and racism. And we have to remember that the ruling class wants to make an example out of us here in Seattle. And why? Because even one example threatens the legitimacy of their system. And we have to also remember that given the deep and irreconcilable divide between the capitalist bosses and wealthy people who want to preserve this dysfunctional system at all costs, on the one hand, and working people who have everything at stake and have a real desire for a different kind of society, we have to expect that given these irreconcilable interests, whenever we succeed in fighting back and winning something and empowering people, then the wealthy will attack us to force us to back down. So the solution is not fighting back or not showing courage. The solution is to defend against these attacks and understand that anytime they succeed in beating us down, that will only embolden them further. And if we succeed in winning against the recall, it will have the opposite effect, which is ordinary people, young people, not just in Seattle, but all across the US and even worldwide, I'm quite confident, will be quite, their confidence will increase, and they will feel like, well, if we could do it in Seattle, if we could do it in the US, we can do it here too. And that's why it's really important that everybody stand in solidarity with this campaign and remember how much we have at stake, because we know we can't afford to go back to normal. Normal was not working. The status quo was not working, and it has certainly proven itself completely incapable of dealing the multiple crises that working people face. And that's why it's so crucial that we build a united international working class and socialist movement.
Thank you so much, Kshama, for joining us today. And I hope to see you again real soon.
Thank you so much.
Wow, that was so good and so interesting, and so it's always so inspiring to hear from Kshama. I think, we're all simping a bit here. So thank you so much for giving us the time. I'm sure you're really, really busy right now. So yeah, I think this was a really, really interesting discussion generally about the US. I know I've learned a lot, and it's always great to hear from the people on the ground. And I think that kind of leads us to the shout out of the week. Yes, so obviously I know that we've spoken about the US a lot, but I think we have to give the shout out of the week this week to our US branches that have been all over the place. We're so lucky to have so many members of our US section here with us today, because they've been doing so much. Branches across the country led and also participated in actions calling to basically not let Trump steal this election. And this is the type of work that our organization does everywhere, and obviously now in the US specifically. So we are kind of organizing those actions and going on the streets. We're not just online. So it would be really, really good if you, first of all, check out our US section's activities and website, especially if you're in the US. And if you're not in the US, check out the section that's closest to you, because we do these things all the time. So I wanted to give this shout out to every one of our members in the US and to our organization in the US generally. And, it's so important, the work that we're doing on the ground with this election, especially with Trump going basically insane. So, if we want to protect democracy, to protect the right to vote, it's so crucial that we go on the street and we fight. And that's what the US section of the International Socialist Alternative is doing right now. So I also wanted to give a little shout out, if you are listening and you are not members of our organization, that branches all across the US, but also all across the world, are going to be hosting events and Zoom meetings on the election and the next steps. So check out the nearest branch to you and see, maybe you can join into one of the discussions as well. And of course, join the fight on the streets too. So thank you everyone for being here. It was a great episode. So happy to learn more about this crazy election that's not being off my screen for the past few days. Next week we've got a very, very special episode. It's the 20th episode of World to Win. So we're gonna focus mainly on one of the greatest Marxists of all time. We're going to discuss Friedrich Engels on his 200th birthday, and the rise of conspiracy theories as well around the world, which I'm personally very interested to hear our analysis on. So tune in to our 20th episode next week, same time, same place. And also, talking about place, this is going to be the last time that we are going to stream those episodes on Facebook. So make sure that you go to our YouTube page and subscribe so that you still get notified when we go live and that you can still watch this episode. So next week, don't search for us on Facebook, go straight to YouTube and we'll discuss Friedrich Engels. Bye-bye.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!